before we begin. Tell us, what time is it where you are? And where in the world are you listening from? Drop your answer in the comments. We love knowing who's drifting off with us tonight. And if you enjoy slow, forgotten histories told softly, ... Don't forget to subscribe for more.com. Immersive bedtime stories, the kind that don't rush, don't shout, and don't end too soon. Now, settle in. Let's begin. Asterisk, the sun on the Punjab plains had always been too bright for comfort. In August that year, in 1947, it was especially harsh. Not because it was hotter, but because the air felt different, settled, like something was waiting to break. In a small town between Lahore and Amritsar. On the rail line, where trains once paused for chai and updates sat, a dusty little post office, pale, brown, and tired, like the rest of the town. It had a tin roof that clanged when the wind blew, and a bench outside, worn down by waiting bodies. Inside that modest outpost, among wooden drawers labeled in both English and Urdu, sat postmaster Lala Krishan, a man who had sorted mail with the exact same wrist motion for 38 years. His beard had turned gray long before partition became a word worth whispering. He wore the same crisp dhoti and white undershirt every morning. The ink on his fingertips had become permanent over the years, a second skin darker than memory. He was not a political man. He was not a rich man. He was a man of schedules, train schedules, postal deliveries, ledger books. His entire world was defined by timeliness and return addresses. But in the weeks leading up to partition, nothing arrived on time. And sometimes things didn't arrive at all. The telegraph wires above his office hummed with rumors. Every conversation round him on the train platform at the sweet shop next door, even in the hushed corridors of the civil lines, spoke of people leaving, or planning to, or worse, not planning to, 'cause they had no idea yet that they were in the wrong country. By August 12th, Lahore was no longer just Lahore. It was now the other side. People had begun using the phrase across the border, even though no official line had been drawn. Krishan, like the others, waited for clarity from Delhi. But the post office remained open every morning. He would unlock the door, sweep the floor, align the brass stamps and paper bundles, and sit at his desk. People came less frequently now, but they still came mostly to ask questions that had nothing to do with mail. Have you heard if the next train to Delhi is safe? Is it true Muslims will have to leave by the 15th? My uncle says. We should burn our papers, should we? And always, Krishan would respond with silence, or a nod, or sometimes simply by adjusting his spectacles and returning to his ink pad. Behind him hung a portrait of King George VI, slightly tilted. Below it, a dusty clock ticked loud and slow. Exactly noon each day, the postmaster took out his tiffin and ate in quiet. Even as the outside world seemed to collapse, inside that office, time had its own code of conduct. But something changed on the morning of August 14th. That day, sealed canvas sack arrived, flung unceremoniously from a passing truck, contained the final postal dispatch from the Lahore office, addressed to the town still considered part of India. It was a stack of government envelopes marked with the new emblem, the lion capital of Ashoka, replacing the crown. The British insignia was gone. It was the postmaster's first official notice that the country he had worked for had changed. He stared at the packets longer than usual. He did not open them. He simply held them against his chest for a moment, like a man trying to recognize a child after many years, and then began sorting. By then, rumors were no longer rumors. The town next door had seen fires. The railway bridge, 2 stops west, had been bombed, and the last train that passed through had carried not passengers, but corpses. Still, the post office remained open. The townspeople began to notice. They would walk past, clutching their bundles and sacks. eyes filled with questions. But the postmaster, now seated behind his desk with a faint tremble in his hands, continued stamping, sorting, and signing. People asked him, Lala ji, aren't you leaving? This area may fall under Pakistan. Aren't you afraid? And his answer, each time, was the same. If the mail is still coming, then someone still believes this is a place worth delivering to. What he didn't say was that his wife had already gone to Delhi with their eldest son. He had packed her a small bag, fastened with thread, and written her a note in neat Urdu script. Don't worry, I will follow once the backlog is cleared. There was always more backlog. Letters addressed to men who had died in riots. Postcards from Karachi that would never be claimed. Money orders sent from soldiers in Burma, destined for houses that no longer had walls. He sorted them all. The station master left. The grain merchant left. The Hindu families left in the dark of night without farewells. The Muslim families began locking their doors from the inside, speaking in whispers, unsure if they'd be labeled traitors for staying or cowards for leaving. But Krishan Lal remained. Some said he was too proud. Others said he had nowhere else to go. But most agreed that he was simply doing what he always did, waiting for instructions that never came. And one morning, they say, he did not open the post office. The shutters remained down. The flag was not hoisted. The door remained bolted from the inside. Some children threw pebbles to see if he would stir. Others shouted his name, but there was no reply. When the townspeople finally broke the lock, they found him slumped in his chair, spectacles in hand, one unfinished letter resting on the desk. It was not addressed to anyone, just a sheet of government paper, with 2 words written in faint, deliberate strokes. I remained. Asterisk. The post office door stayed open for 3 more days after Krishan Lal's body was found, not because anyone chose to keep it open, but because no one remembered to close it. The town had changed, not with a bang, not with any grand announcement, but with a slow quiet that creeped into the corners, the kind of silence that grows not from peace, but from absence, from knowing too much and choosing not to speak. The wooden desk inside the post office still held bundles of unsorted letters. The ledger lay open to a half-filled page. The ink bottle, tipped slightly to one side, had dried at the rim, but no one dared touch them. Outside, the railway line had become unpredictable. Trains still came but rarely, and when they did, people didn't ask where they came from. They only asked how many were alive inside. A few neighbors swept the street. Some collected the garbage that the wind had tossed near the veranda. But the post office itself remained untouched, as though time had been paused in a small square building with a tin roof and broken locks. It was the school teacher, Mrs. Gurleen Kaur, who eventually stepped in. She was a tall woman with sharp features softened by fatigue. Her husband had fled weeks before, taking their 2 daughters with him to Amritsar. But Gurleen had stayed, convinced that the school children needed her more than her fear did. She had known the postmaster only in passing. He never spoke much. But he once returned her lost shawl after it had slipped through the school gate, folded it, dusted it, turned it like it was a telegram. She stood in the open doorway of the post office now, arms crossed, staring at the unmanned desk. You left it like a question, she whispered to the air. Then she walked inside. For the first time in weeks, someone moved the papers. She placed the unsorted mail into bundles, marked them with chalk. She lit a single candle and placed it beneath the portrait of King George. By still crooked dot. Then she wrote something in the register. Office remains in limbo. Status unknown. We are not done remembering. The next morning, a few children from her school came by. They watched as she sat at the desk and slowly organized the forms. A boy named Hemad helped sweep. A girl named Asha tied the loose tags back onto the crates of money orders. and slowly word spread that the post office was still functioning, except no one was really sending letters anymore. They were bringing them letters to the dead, to the missing, to the parts of themselves they'd left behind on the other side of a brand new border. One man brought a stack of unsent letters addressed to his brother in Lahore. He said, "I know they won't be delivered, but if I hand them to someone who still wears the uniform, maybe it counts." A woman left a postcard with no stamp. It read only, "We lived here once." And each day, the children helped Gurleen sort them not by destination, but by emotion. One pile for hope, one for grief, one for apology. Sometimes people came just to sit, not to speak, not to remember, just to sit in a space that hadn't been looted, burned, or abandoned. The post office had become a kind of unofficial memorial, home, but no one called it that. Kate, no one called it anything. They just said, "Let's meet where Laji used to be." No official came to shut it down. No police officer asked questions. It was as though the building had been removed from maps, or perhaps spared by maps. But the town kept changing. A few more Muslim families vanished in the night, their houses left unlocked, their water pitchers still half full. The Hindu refugees from the west began to trickle in quiet, then, carrying bundles wrapped in saris or old prayer rugs. One of them, a young boy named Rayesh, walked into the post office and stared at the walls. "This is like the one in Rawalpindi," he said. "My uncle worked there. He used to sort the British mail because his English was good." But no one answered. Asterisk. He placed a drawing on the table. Tia. It was of a postman with one leg, holding a letter above his head like a flag. He said, "I think the postman should come back." And then he left. The next morning, someone pinned a hand-drawn sign above the doorway. It read, "Letters for those who never read them." No one claimed responsibility for it, but nobody took it down. The post office had become a quiet ritual. People came to leave behind what they couldn't carry with them into the new world. Not objects, but confessions, stories, pieces of a time that no longer existed. A Muslim widow came each week to place a jasmine flower on the windowsill. She never said who it was for. She always whispered something into the dust before leaving. An old Sikh man came to read the same 3 letters over and over, each addressed to someone named Junaid. He never explained who Junaid was. Some evenings, the wind knocked the door open and scattered a few envelopes. The children would run after them like they were chasing butterflies, laughing because laughter had become rare and felt out of place. And still, no one touched the portrait of the king. Weeks turned to months, and then, one day, a government truck arrived. 2 men stepped out, wearing khaki uniforms. One held a clipboard. The other held a toolbox. They looked around, confused. "This office was supposed to be closed," one said. They walked in, inspected the drawers, took photographs, measured the walls. Then they found the register. It's the one where Gurleen had written, "I'm not done remembering." They stared at it for a long time, but they didn't cross it out. Instead, one of them added, "Note, archive this office. Do not demolish." Reason, unknown cultural value. Hey, the town watched as the truck left, and nothing changed. The door stayed open. The bench outside was repaired. The ink bottles were refilled. No letters ever reached their destination, but no one came to complain, because by then, the post office had become something else. Not a building, not a service, but a witness to what happens when nations are divided overnight and people are asked to choose sides before they even understand the question. And even as new borders were drawn and flags hoisted, a silent desk in Punjab remained untouched, unread, and quietly waiting. Asterisk. Years passed. Dust began to settle in layers so thick They softened the sharp edges of memory. The town changed its shape gradually, like a shoreline being redrawn by the tide, not erased, just rearranged. But the post office remained. The tin roof rusted, but didn't collapse. The wooden drawers squeaked more than they used to, but they still opened. The clock above the desk stopped ticking, frozen permanently at 4:37 p.m., but no one seemed to mind. Most people found comfort in the stillness of that hour. There were no longer official deliveries, of course. L stopped coming long ago. The trains ran on different schedules now, and many no longer stopped here, But every week, someone came by. Someone who remembered, or someone who had been told. A woman who had left for Louisiana as a child came back, now gray-haired and slow, and walked through the building in silence. She said to no one in particular, "Gave me my first letter when my cousin got married in Delhi." I held it with 2 hands. Then she folded a blank envelope, placed it in the old mailbag, and left. Another man arrived years later with his grandson. He pointed to the bench and said, "That's where your great-grandmother waited every Tuesday to see if my uncle had survived." The child asked, "Did he?" The man didn't answer. Instead, opened a tiffin box and placed it gently on the table, still warm, as though for someone who might arrive soon. He told his grandson, "Leave it there. Maybe someone's hungry." Then they walked out. What the post office had become was something no one had expected. Not a museum, not a relic, but a place of ongoing pause. It wasn't cleaned often, but it wasn't abandoned. It wasn't celebrated, but it wasn't forgotten. It simply endured. Teachers brought students there on the 15th of August each year, not to celebrate Independence Day, but to talk quietly about what it cost. They would point to the dusty portrait, still crooked, and ask, "Why do you think this wasn't removed?" And someone, usually a girl from the back, would say, "Maybe because even broken things tell the truth." No one taught history there, but everyone learned it, and not the grand version of history, not the one with heroes and treaties and parades, but the quieter one, the version written in undelivered letters, in names that were never updated in official records, courts, and postmasters, who didn't know they were living inside the last normal day. Years turned into decades. The town received electricity, then a paved road, then a cell phone tower. But the post office didn't change. They wired the outside for light, but no one installed a switch. They discussed painting the walls, but no one ever chose a color. They said the tin roof should be replaced, but somehow it never was. Every time someone mentioned demolishing it, a story would surface. My grandmother used to cry right here every time she heard a train whistle. Or, my uncle was found by tracing a letter he left here. Or, I met my future wife while waiting to file a change of address form right at that window. And so it stayed, even long after everyone who had lived through partition had died. The post office was still there, and it became something more than a building. It became a question. A place people visited not to send or receive, but to ask, why do we draw borders faster than we build bridges? Why does a nation's birth require so many funerals? And why do the quietest people, clerks, teachers, mothers, guards carry the heaviest pieces of history? In Delhi, at a small archive, a folder exists, is labeled Undelivered Post-Partition Period. Inside it, there are hundreds of letters from that little town. Some are addressed, most are not. Some are folded with care. Others were written in pencil, already fading. None were returned, and tucked into the back of that folder is a page torn from an old register, the one kept by Gurleen Kaur after the postmaster's death. In her handwriting, slanted and careful, is written, "History will forget this town, but this town will not forget what history did." To this day, on the eve of every August 15th, Someone still lights a dia inside the post office. No one knows who. No one tries to stop them. Hey, and no one asks if it's legal, because for a building without electricity, that soft light means something more than memory. It means witnessing. The kind of witnessing that doesn't speak loudly, doesn't argue, doesn't point fingers. It just remains, exactly like the last thing the postmaster ever wrote, 2 words in clean ink, faded but readable. I remained. And perhaps in some quiet way. So do we. Asterisk, if you stand at the edge of the platform in Darababa Nanak just before sunrise, you'll hear the soft rustling of wind through the wheat fields, the clang of distant milk cans being loaded onto bicycles, and the faint creak of rusted railway signs swaying like tired flags. You might not realize at first that the station is barely used anymore, and you certainly wouldn't guess that its original name, Mammon Naga, meaning City of Peace, was supposed to be a symbol of harmony between Hindus, Muslims, Sikhs, and the many who moved through Punjab before anyone imagined such a thing as partition. But that was before the summer of Partition. Before the maps were redrawn with rulers and ink. Before the trains ran red. The station had once been nothing remarkable. 2 low platforms, a small waiting room with chipped blue benches, a tea vendor who poured with his left hand because his right had been burned in childhood, a dog who slept near the ticket booth like it was his job. Trains came and went. People came and went. That was the way of things. But then the letters started arriving, not from the rail authority, from strangers, from families, from Delhi, from Lahore. Letters warning of unrest, letters begging for answers, letters asking if it was safe to travel. Then came the orders. Trains were to begin transporting refugees. Aman Nagar was no longer a local stop. It had become a transfer point for history. The first train to arrive was quiet. Not empty, but quiet. People inside it sat with bundles, tied in haste. Eyes wide. No one knew if they were going toward something or away from something. Many had no idea where they were going at all. They were told only one thing: board the train. It goes to your new home. But the second train was different. It arrived with smashed windows and no whistle. And inside it were bodies, not moving, not breathing, just still. Asterisk, the station master, a young man named Iqbal Singh, stared at the doors as they opened. He was not a soldier. He was not trained for this. He was 27 years old, had taken the job to support his younger sister, and had once written a poem about railway tracks being veins of the nation. He had believed in connection, in journey, in continuity. Now, standing before the lifeless figures of men, women, and children draped over wooden benches and sacks of grain, he could not find the words. No one could. The tea vendor fainted. The dog ran, and for a few moments, the station fell into the kind of silence that feels physical, like a curtain dropped across the lungs of everyone still standing. More trains came, each one worse than the last. Some had no drivers, no guards. They had simply been pushed along the tracks from across the border, a gesture of horror disguised as transportation. Some were locked from the outside. Asterisk. When opened, they released not passengers, but a kind of grief so concentrated it clung to the wood. Iqbal Singh stopped sleeping. He began logging each train in a register, not by time, but by what was inside. He wrote, August 17th train, no, 92 to 43 bodies, 3 alive. August 19th train, no, 96, no survivors. Stores jammed. August 21st, unmarked train, infants only, all deceased. The ink ran out faster than before. Every few nights, a man from the district office would arrive, collect the register, and leave. No condolences, no plans, just paperwork. The townspeople began calling the station Kunagar, City of Blood. Some protested. Others left. A few came anyway. They needed the trains. They needed the hope. And so, every morning, Iqbal Singh stood on the platform, blew a whistle into a sky that never responded, and prepared to record whatever history decided to send him that day. Once, a woman arrived holding a photograph and a child. She said nothing, just handed him the photo, pointed to the tracks, and whispered, "He left 2 weeks ago." This was his face. "Please, just write it down." He did. He wrote her husband's name in the margin of the register, then added a line that wasn't required. "If he comes back, tell him she waited here." But no one came back. Trains arrived with the same mechanical finality. Steel, smoke, silence, doors. Sometimes the tracks echoed long before the train arrived at Erie Herald, caught like the scream of a ghost caught between worlds. The dog never returned. The tea vendor packed up and disappeared one night, left only the kettle behind, as if someone else might still need it. And Iqbal Singh, he stopped writing poems. He kept records instead. Every body was logged, every scar noted, every scrap of paper found in the pocket letters, ration cards, family photos was placed in a box labeled unclaimed. By the end of September, that box had over 200 items. By October, it had to be moved to the waiting room because it wouldn't fit in the office anymore. He tried to keep the station clean. He swept every morning, polished the railings, adjusted the clocks. But bloodstains don't leave so easily, and the smell of fear lingers long after the passengers are gone. One day, a train arrived that never opened its doors. No one could force them. The guards decided to send it onward to the next station, but Iqbal Singh stood in front of it, arms outstretched. He said, "This is the last place they were meant to be. You don't pass grief to someone else like luggage." They opened the doors. Inside, only silence, and then a cough, a hand. One survivor, a girl, perhaps 8 years old, clutching a silver bangle. She didn't speak, she didn't cry. She simply stared at Iqbal and blinked. He carried her out himself. She lived, but never remembered her name. Iqbal gave her one amen peace, because even at the train station named for peace, she was the only one that seemed willing to return. Asterisk, they never closed Amen Nagar station, not officially. There was no government memo, no ribbon cutting for a new terminal, no press release explaining its fate. Simply stopped appearing on schedules. Keams quietly omitted its name, and the trains, those that once thundered toward it with brutal regularity, no longer came. But Iqbal Singh kept coming. He still woke at 5 a.m., still wore the same khaki shirt with the brass buttons, still stood at the edge of the platform and blew his whistle into the wind, even though no engine answered. Every morning he swept the waiting room, not because anyone sat there anymore, but because the act itself felt like memory management. If he didn't sweep, the dust might settle, so thick that even the past would disappear beneath it. The girl, Amin, had become his shadow. She followed him without question, holding his sleeve when he bent down to tie his laces, carrying his ink bottle like a sacred thing. She never asked about the trains. She never asked about her parents. She simply existed, quiet, alert, and deeply attentive to the rituals of grief that defined her guardian. Iqbal had taken her to the refugee officer once, in the next district over. But when the man began asking questions, name, religion, caste, place of birth, Amin remained silent. She held Iqbal's hand tighter and whispered only one word, "Here." So he brought her back and never asked her again. By late 1948, the government had changed focus. The borders were drawn, the armies repositioned, the treaties signed. Refugee camps grew and then shrank, some turning into permanent neighborhoods. New countries were learning how to function, how to forget. But the station still waited. Sometimes Wanderers arrived, stragglers looking for lost relatives, elderly men from Bhutan, young boys from across the border trying to smuggle information, traders with nowhere else to go. Iqbal offered them water. He showed them the registers. They almost always refused to look. There were 7 full volumes by Din each, bound in fabric, torn from the train seats, each carefully marked in Urdu and English. A record of the human wreckage left behind by the decisions of people who would never visit Amen Nagar. He had started categorizing them by theme. Register 1, children found. Register 2, identity, cards with no bodies. Register 3, bodies with no names. Register 4, survivors who left letters. Register 5, women carrying nothing but silence. Register 6, photographs of people who never claimed them. Register 7, rumors heard, never confirmed. That last one was controversial. Some officials said it was unprofessional, a record of gossip, they called it. Tipo argued that in the absence of certainty, even whispers were worth preserving. He'd written on the first page, if no one is believed, then no one is remembered. The railway board sent him notices. 3, in fact, each more impatient than the last. The third one read, your presence is no longer required. Please vacate the premises and submit all station property. Iqbal didn't respond. Instead, he copied the notice into Register 7 under unconfirmed official statements. Then he continued his work. Amen grew taller. She began to help with more than ink bottles, reading the old ledgers aloud, correcting names that had been scrawled in haste. She had a soft voice. When she read names, they sounded like prayers each day. She would select one photograph from the unclaimed box and place it on the waiting room bench. She said, maybe someone will recognize this face today. No one ever did, but she still changed the photo every morning by the 1950s. The local government sent a new officer, a younger man named Mr. Sharma. He arrived in a polished jeep, wearing sunglasses that reflected the station walls in perfect symmetry. He walked in briskly, clipboard in hand. I'm here to inspect and close the site, he said. Iqbal nodded. He offered tea. Mr. Sharma refused. There's nothing left to process here, the officer said. It's been 5 years. The country has moved on. These files belong in a warehouse or a fire. Amen stood behind Iqbal. Her eyes didn't blink. Sir, Iqbal said, gently, do you know what happens when we burn a train ticket before it's used? The officer frowned. Iqbal continued, it becomes ash. But the journey still exists. You've only erased the proof, not the path. Mr. Sharma sighed. He walked through the station, inspecting the cracked roof, the faded signage, the rusted tracks, now sprouting grass. Kay paused by Register 7. What's this? He asked. Rumors, Iqbal replied. The officer opened to a random page. It read, March 1948. Man with turban seen walking along tracks, repeating wife's name. Said she boarded train 105. Train 105 never arrived. Mr. Sharma closed the book. There's no category for this, he muttered. That's why I made one, Iqbal said. The officer left 2 hours later. He didn't issue a shutdown order, but neither did he return. Amen drew a map of the station by hand. She colored it with charcoal from the old furnace, marked the benches, the well, the broken lamp near platform 2. She drew the face of the dog who once slept near the ticket booth. She drew the hand of a child waving from a train window. She drew a postbox with no letters inside. At the top of the page, she wrote, map of a place that waited, and beneath it, somewhere between here and not here, Iqbal hung the drawing inside the signal room. No train ever passed again, but each year, on the same date in August, a few people came back. Not many, just a few. Some carried letters. Others brought soil from the places they'd run from. Some brought ashes in jars. One man simply walked the length of the platform, whispering a name. They never stayed long, but before they left, most of them visited the waiting room, and some just infuriated the registers with shaking hands, with eyes that could not unsee. And one day, take decades later, an old man in a wool vest arrived with his granddaughter. He held her hand as she skipped along the platform. He said, "My brother was supposed to arrive here. We never knew what happened." Amen, now older herself, handed him register too. He found the name. He found the date. He cried. Yes, but it was the kind of cry that straightens the spine, not breaks it. And when he left, he said, "Thank you. Thank you for keeping the story." A man said nothing. She simply placed a silver bangle on the bench and waited. Asterisk. It was never truly clear when the station stopped being a station. There was no last whistle, no final train, no broadcast on the intercom. Just faded slowly, quietly, until one day people forgot it had ever been on the schedule. But the silence was deceptive, because the station never stopped receiving what the rest of the world refused to carry. Not trains. No, but memories. Letters slipped under the door at night. Packages with no return addresses. Candles left burning along the tracks, their flames trembling in the wind. Eamon and Iqbal began cataloging these too. They opened a new register, number 8. Offerings. The entries were short, careful. August 1959. Bundle of wedding bangles, wrapped in newspaper, no note. June 1962. Small wooden box with children's shoes, smelled of camphor. January 1966. Tiffin, containing 2 rotis, half-eaten, still warm. Sometimes the items came with words. One man left a folded scarf with a single sentence scribbled on it. "She wore this when we boarded the wrong train." Another brought a copy of the Koran, wrapped in silk. He placed it on the bench and whispered, "My father said the tracks wouldn't take sides. Only people do." Iqbal aged, but his posture never bent. His beard turned silver. His hands trembled slightly when turning the registers, but his voice remained clear. Each evening, he would sit with Eamon and read out entries. Not because they didn't remember, but because remembering had become the ritual. Like brushing dust from gravestones no one else visits. And then, one winter, he didn't wake up. He passed away in his sleep, wrapped in a wool shawl beneath the station desk. On his chest lay a single sheet of paper, not typed, not signed, just written in his own hand. "Please, keep the door open." He was buried near the far edge of the station yard, beneath the neem tree that had once shaded waiting passengers. No ceremony, just Eamon and a few villagers who still remembered his whistle in the mornings. For days, the station echoed with something missing. Eamon swept the floors herself now, poured the tea herself, maintained the registers, and opened the postbox, even when it was empty. But grief has strange ways of shaping time, and before long, she became the station. People spoke of her the way they once spoke of him. The girl who never left. The girl with the bangle. The girl who remembers everything. When journalists discovered the site in the 1980s, it made a few quiet headlines. The ghost station of Punjab. The place where Partition still breathes. Aman refused interviews. She said, "Some things are too large for words." But she allowed them to photograph the registers. She let them take copies, never the originals. One of the reporters asked, "Do you consider yourself a historian?" She shook her head. "I am not here to teach," she said. "I am here to hold." Later that year, a delegation from Delhi arrived. They offered her a medal. She declined it. They offered to turn the station into a museum. She asked, "Will people be allowed to cry here, or just read plaques?" They said nothing, so she kept it as it was. No velvet ropes, no glass displays, just the old wooden bench, the faded photo wall, and the long line of registers resting on the table beside a flickering lantern, and the postbox still open. One rainy evening, a group of schoolchildren visited. They were loud at first, giddy from the field trip, tossing stones along the tracks. But when they entered the waiting room, they fell silent. One child whispered, "It smells like remembering." Another asked, "Why don't they clean the walls?" Eamon smiled, "Because the dust remembers too." She showed them Register 1. Read a few names aloud. Then she handed them blank sheets of paper and said, "If there's someone you miss, write them something." Some wrote letters, some drew. One boy simply folded the page and placed it on the bench without a word. And for years afterward, children returned, not just from that village, but from far places, cities, other countries. They brought their silences with them, and the station accepted all of it. By the 2000s, Eamon was old, her hands no longer steady, her eyes dimmer, but she still swept the tracks, still changed the photo on the bench each day, still left a dia burning every August. 15. And when the electricity finally reached the area over, 50 years late, someone offered to install lights. In the station, she refused. "Let it remain in half darkness," she said. "It suits those who are still looking for something." She died in a sleep one night, like Iqbal, wrapped in a wool shawl, a silver bangle on her wrist, and next to her, a page from Register 8. It read, "If you are reading this, you are part of the story now." They buried her beside Iqbal. No epitaph, just a wooden plank with one word carved by hand, "Eamon." Then the station. Still there, the wind moves through the arches like breath. The registers sit quietly, waiting. Sometimes people still come, though less now. But they don't come for the trains. They come to ask a question they cannot phrase and to leave behind the answer they never found. Because, in the end, Eamon Nugger was never truly about arrival or departure. It was about the space in between, the platform between countries, between families, between memory and forgetting. And though the name was changed on every map, the station never accepted it. It still answers to the one it was born with, peace, even when it only ever saw death. Asterisk, before the riots. Rawalpindi was a city of shade. Tall neem trees leaned over mud paths. Courtyards were ringed with bougainvillea. Women drew water from wells with ropes worn smooth by generations of use. Everything moved in rhythm with breath, slow, familiar, forgettable. The houses had high walls, but their doors were rarely locked. Children from Muslim, Sikh, and Hindu families played together without hesitation. They dared differences spoken of in books or sermons meant nothing in the rhythm of shared meals and neighborhood gossip. It was a city known more for its stillness than for its significance, which is perhaps why, when it broke so cleanly, not loudly, not suddenly, but like cloth tearing in the middle of the night, heard by a few, witnessed by a fewer. The trouble started in early March of 1947, not all at once. It began as a rumor. A stone through a window. A man found dead in a lane he didn't belong to. And then a name began to circulate. Gold Mandi, a neighborhood where the first flames were seen rising, where the walls began to whisper. By the time the city noticed, it was already too late. In the narrow lanes of Rawalpindi, the wells were the center of every home. Each courtyard had one. The sound of ropes sliding over brick was part of daily life. But in March of that year, the wells changed. They became silent because people stopped lowering buckets. They were no longer used for water. They were used for hiding. It started with a family in a Mohalla Raja bazaar who lowered their daughter into the well during the first round of violence. She was 15. Her name was Harbin's Kaur. Her parents told her to remain silent. No matter what she heard, they sealed the well from above with a wooden plank and a stone mill. 2 days later, when they returned to pull her out, she was still alive, but she never spoke again. Across the city, similar stories unfolded. Some wells held one person, some held whole families. Sometimes they were lowered in as a last resort. Sometimes they jumped in themselves to hide from men who moved like shadows and used fire as language. Many wells became graves, not by choice, but by delay. By the time help arrived, the ropes were gone, the water was red, and the silence above had returned. Neighbors began avoiding the wells. They feared what they might see reflected in the water. They feared hearing their names echoed back from below, but they never covered them. Even as the buildings collapsed, as families vanished, as fires consumed whole alleys, the wells remained open, uncovered, like eyes. The British reports from that month mention Rawalpindi massacres only briefly. They use phrases like sectarian tension, uncontrolled, mobs, and civil disturbance. But they do not mention the wells. They do not mention how some were filled with women who had doused themselves in kerosene, rather than be found by those who carried swords with slogans. They do not mention that some wells still held whispers years later. And perhaps that is why the locals remember so clearly, because when something is forgotten officially, it grows sharper in private. One man, Mian Bashir, turned to his childhood home in Rawalpindi in the 1960s. His family had fled to Lahore. He was a child when they left, but his memory of the well in their courtyard remained intact. When he found the house, it was crumbling, but the well was still there. He dropped a stone. Inside, it took 5 seconds to reach water. He leaned over the edge. He later told a reporter that he didn't see a reflection, only a shadow that moved like it was breathing. Another family, newly settled in a post-partition home in Rawalpindi, reported that their well would fill with clear water in the morning but turn red by dusk. They thought it was rust. A geologist confirmed the water was clean. A neighbor said, "It's not the water, it's what it remembers." No one built over the wells. Even as new housing colonies emerged, roads were paved, and electricity hummed through streets that once knew only lanterns. The wells remained, some sealed, some left open, but none forgotten. A professor at the University of Punjab once conducted an informal survey in the 1980s. She asked elderly residents of Rawalpindi, "What do you remember most about partition?" Nearly 40% of them said the wells, not the riots, not the trains, not the headlines. The wells, because they had heard things that could not be printed, because they had held what no one else could. Some whispered prayers into them. Some dropped offerings, flowers, coins even, poems. Some dropped offerings, flowers, coins, even poems. One woman left a letter addressed to her mother, who had vanished in 1947. It read, "I still wait for your bangles to echo up the rope." She dropped it inside, then walked away. Did she hear anything echo back? She never said. And yet, to this day, some claim that if you stand beside the old wells of Rawalpindi at night and the wind is still, you can hear names, not shouted, not wept, just spoken softly, one after another, like a roll call of the forgotten names, not etched into monuments or textbooks, names that only water remembers, asterisk years after the violence subsided. And even after the city began to reassemble itself into something resembling normalcy, the wells remained unchanged. They were not repaired. They were not praised. They were not condemned. They were tolerated, left in backyards like unspeaking elders, too familiar to honor, too haunted to approach. Children were told not to play near them, not because they might fall, but because the water remembers. That was the phrase, whispered in markets, repeated in schools, and occasionally scribbled in the margins of old journals. The water remembers. By the early 1950s, much of Rawalpindi had been renamed, rebuilt, or simply left behind. Neighborhoods like Kartarpura, once teeming with Sikh and Hindu families, were emptied, their temples boarded up, their courtyards overtaken by weeds or resettled by strangers. But the wells remained, like punctuation marks at the end of sentences. No one finished writing. One civil engineer named Rashid Mahmood, hired to modernize the drainage system, documented over 200 functioning pre-partition wells across the Rawalpindi district. Of those, nearly 40 had no visible use, but had never been filled. He noted in his report, locals resist demolition, offer superstitious or emotional reasons, suggest wells contain history. History was not a valid reason in bureaucratic language, so the report was archived and ignored. But Rashid didn't forget. A month after completing his survey, he returned to one particular well behind an old Haveli near Babur Bazaar. It was surrounded by a broken boundary wall, hidden beneath the shade of a pomegranate tree. He leaned in and listened. He later told a colleague, half laughing, half shaking, that what he heard was not sound, but a memory in liquid form. He couldn't describe it, but he never returned. Local women, especially older ones, developed their own rituals. They would walk to the wells on certain nights, especially in March, the month the violence began, sit beside them with a clay pot of rose water. They would dip their fingers, sprinkle the petals in silence, and sometimes murmur names, always names. Names of sisters, mothers, daughters, names that had not been spoken aloud in years. A widow named Shakuntala, who had stayed behind when the rest of her family fled to India, was known to visit one such well every Friday evening. She never entered the mosque, never visited the market. The well she visited religiously. She once told a neighbor, "It is the only place in this city that does not ask me to explain why I stayed." One afternoon in 1974, a young boy collecting leaves near an old well in Sadukabad spotted something wedged in the brickwork. It was a rusted tin box, sealed tight. Inside, a damp, folded cloth, wrapped around a child's anklet, and a locket bearing 2 initials etched in Sanskrit. No one came forward to claim it. The boy's mother buried it under the neem tree beside their house. She didn't report it. He just said, "We don't bring the past into sunlight. It doesn't belong there." And slowly, these quiet customs formed their own folklore. There were wells said to cry during thunderstorms, wells whose water never dried, even during drought, wells where birds never drank, wells where no plants grew nearby, even when rain was generous. A journalist from Karachi, working on a feature about partition memorials, visited Rawalpindi in the 1980s. He asked a local elder named Faizuddin, "Why aren't there any statues or plaques here?" Faizuddin pointed to the old well near the mosque and said, "Because statues tell you what to remember. The wells ask if you still do." The journalist laughed, then leaned in to look. He said later that the depth seemed infinite, that even when shining a torch, the bottom flickered like it moved, that he dropped a small stone but never heard it land, and that night had dreams of a woman calling a name he didn't recognize. He didn't publish the story. He filed it away and wrote about food instead, because history is not always meant for print. Some of it lives only in corners, in cracks, in water. One researcher from the University of Islamabad attempted to study the well's acoustics. Her team brought in sonar, ground microphones, thermal imaging. They hoped to detect underground chambers or airflow anomalies. The data returned inconclusive. Their official conclusion was environmental noise, distortion. But the researcher wrote something different in our private notes. The walls of the wells carry vibrations that don't follow physical logic. It is as though they hold echoes from another time. When asked by a colleague if she'd returned for further study, she said quietly, "No, some places are archives of grief. They're not meant to be understood, only respected." And so they remained. Rawalpindi, modernized, Markets grew. Roads widened. New water systems were installed. Overhead tanks replaced buckets. The city changed shape, but the old wells never lost their place, even in homes built long after partition. Families would leave a patch of ground untouched if it had a well. Sometimes it was superstition. Sometimes it was memory. But more often, it was something in between. And now, decades later, in a city of neon lights and honking traffic, these wells are rarely spoken of in official circles. But they remain in poems, in folk songs, in the stories whispered to children at night. One such story begins like this. If you listen at the right hour, when the moon is hiding and the earth is still, the well will whisper a name, If it's yours, you must never reply. What would happen if you did? The story never says, because some questions are not for answering. Some are for remembering, in the years that followed the partition. The city of Rawalpindi stitched itself back together with thread that never quite matched. Neighborhoods rebuilt, schools reopened, markets resumed their shouting rhythm, but something remained uneven beneath the surface, like a rug stretched over broken tiles, and beneath all of it, the wells. They had once been communal, open to all, used by all. Neighbors borrowing water, drawing ropes across courtyards that smelled of cardamom and diesel. Now, they were only visited in silence. The new generation didn't use them for water, but they knew what they were. They were told never to spit near them, never to toss trash inside, never to joke, because the wells, they were taught, were still listening. In one home on the old outskirts of Kartapura, a boy named Rafiq found an envelope hidden behind the bricks of the well wall. It was yellowed and sealed with wax. No stamp, no address, only a name written on the front, Amrita. He didn't recognize it. He gave it to his grandmother. School stared at it for a long time before placing it in the fire without opening it. He asked, why? Ski said, it was meant to be buried, not delivered. Years later, after she died, Rafiq returned to that same well. He dropped a small slip of paper with a single word on it. Sorry. He didn't wait for an answer. By the early 1990s, few activists tried to mark the wells with plaques, small ceramic tiles inscribed with names, verses, or just a year, 1947. But many of the tiles were stolen, defaced, or quietly removed, not out of malice, but discomfort. People didn't want reminders, they had to explain. One imam, when asked why his mosque had a well in the courtyard that was never used, said that water carries too many stories. We perform ablution with what is clean, not what is sacred. And yet, a few refused to forget. A Sikh man named Sarabjit, who had moved to Canada after partition, turned to Rawalpindi in 1997, 50 years. Later, he carried only one item, a silver chain with a pendant. He asked a taxi driver to take him to Bahar Bazaar. There, he found the ruins of his family home, and behind it, still intact, the well. He didn't cry, he didn't speak. He dropped the chain inside and whispered, "For my sister." Then he left. The taxi driver, confused, asked who his sister was. Sarabjit answered, "Someone whose name was lowered into water instead of being written on paper." And that one sentence was the truth of what the wells had become. They were non-written archives, not of events, but of absences. A historian once said that the tragedy of partition was not only what happened, but what was never recorded. What went uncounted, unnamed to wells. Then came the substitute ledgers. They held names never etched into government records, stories too fractured to make sense, and most of all, choices, the final, terrible choices made by mothers, daughters, fathers, sons, when the mob was at the gate, and there was no more time to jump or to be taken, to hide or to surrender, to silence the child or risk them crying out. And those choices, somehow, remain in the stones. No monument was ever built over the wells. Not in Rawalpindi, not in Delhi, not in Islamabad, Because, Todd, they are not suited to monuments. They are suited to night, to memory. 2 stories told, not in grand museums, but in kitchens, on rooftops, in the hush between generations. An Urdu poet once wrote, asterisk, whacked, sob, kutch, metadita, high, magar, kutch, kuin, rot, main ball, oth te, hain. Time erases everything but some wells. They speak again at night. Asterisk, and perhaps that is the only memorial they need. Not marble, not brass. Just awareness, just a step back from the edge. Asterisk. Just a moment to listen. Because even now, when the moon is low and the traffic fades, if you walk past an old courtyard in Rawalpindi, you might hear a voice not loud, not ghostly, just present, like breath in the earth. And it won't ask for justice. It won't ask for pity. It will only ask, do you still remember my name? And then it will fall quiet again, waiting, as it always has. Asterisk, in the final weeks before partition, there was still work being done. Hammers still struck nails. Saws still met wood. Bricks were still passed hand to hand in neat, practiced lines. The world hadn't quite caught up to its own unraveling, and in a small village just outside of Jhelum, nestled between mustard fields and the slow curve of the Chenab River, one man kept showing up to the construction site of a Hindu temple, measuring timber, setting planks, and wiping sweat from his brow with a handkerchief embroidered with his daughter's name. His name was Abdul Qadir, and he was a carpenter, not a political man, not a learned man, but a man who knew the weight of wood in the quiet of precision. He had built doors for dargahs. He had repaired roofs for gurdwaras. And now he had been asked to craft the inner sanctum of a small, open-air Hanuman temple, a task he accepted with the same shrug he gave to every job. Wood doesn't care who it holds up. He once told a neighbor. The temple had been commissioned by Pandit Raghunath, a man nearly his age. The two had worked side by side before years ago, repairing a schoolroom damaged by monsoon winds. They had argued then about measurements, about cement, about whether one should eat lunch while the sun was directly overhead. But they had never argued about God. They simply didn't need to. The villagers watched them work, now with quiet curiosity. By July of 1947, most people were preparing to leave or to fortify. Rumors of violence had begun to circulate, as if carried on the wind. Names were being whispered with new tension. Maps were discussed with growing suspicion. But Abdul Qadir and Pandit Raghunath kept building. The platform was raised on a square of stone, carved with simple care. The columns were hand-chiseled, their bases slightly uneven, but warmed by effort. Abdul insisted on mortising the joints himself, wooden pegs instead of nails. He said, nails rust, but pegs swell into the wood. They last longer. Perhaps. In some way, he was trying to ensure that something would last each evening. After work, the two men would sit beneath a banyan tree and drink sweetened tea in silence. They never discussed what was coming, but they both knew. They knew the lines had been drawn in Delhi, but had not yet reached their village. They knew trains had already begun running in strange directions, some full of silence, some never arriving. They knew their village had been skipped over in official notices, like a word left out of a sentence that no one realized was missing. But they kept working. One day, as Abdul Qadir was fitting the carved lintel above the sanctum entrance, a boy from the village approached. His name was Ramesh, the son of a local schoolteacher. He said, "My uncle says you're building something that won't exist in a month." Abdul looked down from the ladder. He didn't smile. He only said, "Then I'll make sure it stands strong for the time it does." Ramesh didn't understand then, but years later, he would. By early August, the temple was nearly finished. The inner frame gleamed with oil. The the beams warm and golden. The stone idol had not yet been installed, was still being carved by a sculptor in Gwalior, expected by train the following week. But everything else was ready. Abdul had even carved an inscription above the doorway in Sanskrit, guided letter by Pandit Raghunath. He didn't know the language, but he remembered the rhythm of each curve. The inscription read, "To be still is to endure." The villagers grew more uneasy. Whispers turned to meetings. Lists were made. Families began packing. Muslim families were warned. The West is calling. Hindu families were advised. Better to go before being pushed. But still, the work continued until August 13th. That was the day the violence arrived. Not in a wave, not all at once, but like a drop of ink in water, spreading until it touched every corner. A single fire in a nearby hamlet, a shop looted in the morning, a train that passed without stopping, filled with men holding rifles and shouting slogans no one wanted to repeat. The village no longer felt skipped over, it felt surrounded. That evening, Pandit Raghunath arrived at the temple alone. Abdul Qadir was there already, polishing the final beam. They didn't greet each other. They didn't need to. The air was heavy. The tools had stopped making sound. And in that stillness, Pandit Raghunath placed a small cloth bag on the platform floor. Inside was a bundle of food, some coins, a photograph of his grandfather, and a small clay oil lamp. He said, quietly, "We leave at first light." Abdul nodded, then stood up, wiped his hands on his kurta, and walked to the entrance. He looked at the doorway, at the joint he'd carved just days before, then at the man beside him, and he said, "Leave the door unlocked." Pandit Raghunath blinked. "Why?" Abdul said. "Because someone will come here someday, and they'll need to know we tried." Dan, he reached into his pocket, pulled out a thin strip of SANDALWOOD dot, and placed it on the threshold. It was UNCARVE dot, clean dot A. Blank piece, a space for someone else. Asterisk at dawn on August 14th, 1947. The village began to empty. It wasn't sudden. It wasn't loud. It was a procession of quiet decisions made the night before. The Hindu families, those who had lived in the village for generations, who had married into one another's homes. His names were known even by the trees packed what they could, and left with eyes lowered. Some left with ox carts. Others walked. There were no goodbyes, not because of bitterness, but because no one could bear to say them aloud. Pandit Raghunath was among the last to go. He paused before the newly built temple, one final time. The walls still smelled of wood, oil, and monsoon clay. The beams gleamed in the rising sun. He stood at the threshold, barefoot, and whispered a short prayer, one that didn't ask for protection or revenge, remembrance. Then he looked at the uncarved sandalwood strip Abdul Qadir had left behind. He didn't move it. He only nodded, almost to himself, stepped back. The path he took led westward, toward safety, toward India. Behind him, the village held its breath. Abdul Qadir stayed. The carpenter had no intention of leaving. His family, his wife, and his daughter, Zainabrim, with him. So did his mother, who refused to hear of migration. "This is the house where I buried your father," she said. "I will not unbury myself now." So they stayed. And in the days that followed, the village changed. The locks on doors were new. The faces at the market were fewer. Some houses stood empty, their verandas swept clean, their walls still holding the sounds of vanished conversations. But the temple remained unburned, untouched at first. No one went near it. Some said it was cursed. Others believed it had been booby-trapped by retreating Hindus. But Abdul Qadir kept returning each morning. He brought a cloth to dust the beams, He checked the joints, oiled the door hinges, and every Friday, after prayers at the mosque, he would sit beneath the banyan tree next to the temple and simply rest, his body still sore from the effort of something unfinished. One afternoon, a group of armed men came from a nearby town. They were looking for abandoned property. They asked about the temple. Abdul Qadir met them at the gate. He didn't lie. He said, "I built it. It is mine until its owner returns." One of the men spat on the ground. He asked, "Why would a Muslim protect a Hindu place of worship?" Abdul answered, "Because the wood remembers my hands more than it remembers his God." The men didn't respond. They didn't burn it. They just walked on. The temple remained. Months passed, then years. Partition had been absorbed into textbooks. The violence reduced to footnotes. New boundaries solidified. But in the village, the temple became a question mark that no one erased. No one used it, but no one destroyed it. Children were told not to play inside. Elders walked past it with sideways glances. Some swore they heard a bell chime at night. Oh, no bell had ever been installed. Others said the uncarved wood at the entrance had darkened but never cracked. Abdul Qadir never stopped maintaining it, even after his wife passed, even after his daughter was married off to a farmer in Moulton, even after his knees began to fail and his hands lost their grip. Every week, he wiped the floor clean, replaced the oil lamp, polished the carved beams, the mixture of mustard oil and lemon rind. He never spoke while doing it. He never prayed there. He just cared for it, like someone waiting for a traveler. They may have missed their train, but might still arrive by foot. When asked why he did it, he always said, "Because one day someone will come and ask what we built when the world was falling apart, And I want to say, we built something sacred." In 1973, a stranger arrived, a young man with a thin frame and a satchel full of sketchbooks. He was an architect from Delhi, researching surviving temples in pre-partition Pakistan. He had read about the structure in a faded British surveyor's record that noted a curious instance of Hindu-Muslim collaboration in late 1947. The man introduced himself as Arun Raghunath, grandson of Pandit Raghunath. He had never been to the village. He had never met Abdul Qadir. But when he stepped into the temple, he paused. He traced the columns, ran his fingers along the lintel, and when he reached the doorway, saw the sandalwood strips still uncarved, still in place. He turned to Abdul, who stood nearby with his walking stick. "You kept it, Aaron." Sid. Abdul Qadir nodded. "I did." "Why?" Arun asked. Abdul looked at the wood, then at the young man, and said, "Because it was never mine to finish." Asterisk. The return of Arun Raghunath caused a small stir in the village, though not everyone knew who he was. Some thought he was a government inspector. Others assumed he had come to take possession of the temple, to claim it in the name of history or heritage, or something else official sounding. But Abdul Qadir knew. He knew the moment he saw Arun sketching the corner joints of the outer sanctum, turning the pages of his notebook gently, almost like a prayer. "He's not here to take," Abdul told a neighbor later. "He's here to remember." For 3 days, Arun stayed in the village. He didn't sleep in a hotel, there wasn't one. Slept on the charpai in Abdul Qadir's courtyard, beneath a mosquito net that sagged in the middle. He listened to the carpenter stories, not just about the temple, but about everything else, the floods that once washed out half the main road, the wedding where 3 goats escaped and ruined the meal, the mango tree that bloomed too early in 1951 and confused the entire village calendar. He listened, not because it was required for his research, but because the old man's voice had the weight of timber, steady, grainy, measured on the second. Evening, Arun took out an old envelope. Inside was a photograph, faded and cracked at the edges. It showed 4 men standing before the temple frame. 2 of them easily recognizable. Abdul Qadir with his sleeves rolled up and Pandit Raghunath holding a measuring stick. The other 2 were helpers. Their names, long forgotten. Arun placed the photo before Abdul. "My grandmother kept this," he said. She said he always regretted not seeing the temple completed. Tal stared at the photo a long time. Then he folded it back into the envelope and handed it back. "Not all things are meant to be seen finished," he said. "Some are meant to be remembered unfinished." That night, under the soft light of a lantern and the gentle hum of insects, Arun did something no one had dared to do for decades. He stepped inside the temple with bare feet, unrolled a mat, and sat. He didn't perform a ritual. He didn't light incense. He simply sat for an hour. And when he left, he didn't close the door. The next morning, he brought out his carving tools, delicate instruments, sharpened to whispered thin precision. He approached the sandalwood strip at the entrance of the one Tella had left uncarved in August 1947. The strip had darkened over the years. Its edges were cracked, but the wood was still solid. Still waiting. Arun turned to Abdul. "I don't know what to write," he said. Abdul nodded. "You will when you begin." So he began, not in Sanskrit, not in Urdu, but in a language that carried both silence and memory. He carved slowly, letter by letter, not words of faith or names of gods, but something else. By mid-morning, it was done. 8 simple letters. 1 word. Sothi, companion, because that's what the temple had been. Not a monument, not a miracle, but a companion to memory, to loss, to stubborn. Hope. 2 hands that built even when everything was falling apart. That evening, the village gathered around the temple, for the first time in decades, not for prayer, but to see, to witness. Some had never stepped inside. Some had not spoken aloud the word mandir in years. But they came anyway. They stood in the courtyard under the pale gold of the setting sun and watched as Arun placed a single diya in the center of the sanctum and lit it. Abdul stood beside him. He did not speak. He only watched the flame, and after a long silence, he said, "It's good to see it breathe." Arun left the next day. Before he went, he took Abdul's hand and placed in it a folded square of paper. It was a sketch's drawing of the temple, complete in all its uneven grace. On the back, it had written, "Built 1947, re-remembered 1997, never abandoned." Abdul Qadir passed away that winter. Not suddenly, not painfully, just as wood dries and sets when left in quiet air. The temple remains. It has not become a tourist site. It is not listed in guidebooks. There is no plaque outside, but someone still dusts it every Friday. Someone still oils the door hinges, and each August a letter arrives from Delhi. No envelope, no name, just a folded page, placed carefully at the threshold, always blank, because sometimes silence is the only inscription a place needs. And so the temple stands, built by one man for another, held up not by prayer, but by the memory of how it was built, and by the understanding that in the middle of the largest human migration in history, someone still chose to measure timber and to carve carefully and to leave space for someone else. Asterisk, in August of 1946, the air in Calcutta turned thick not with monsoon rain, but with something heavier, tense, unnamed. It began like any other morning. Trams rattled down College Street. Newspaper boys shouted headlines in 2 languages. Rickshaw pullers swatted flies with dirty towels, waiting for the first fares. Sweet shops boiled milk and sugar into syrup before the day grew too hot. And yet, something was off. People walked faster. Doors closed earlier, and everywhere, voices had lowered as if a collective breath was being held across the city. Then came the date that would never leave, August 16. It would later be called Direct Action Day. But in the mouths of those who lived through it, it was simply known as those 3 days. The 72 hours when Calcutta stopped sleeping and started burning. The day began with a strike, called by the Muslim League to show strength in the demand for Pakistan. A day of protest. No work, no business. How hardle. But this strike was different. It was planned in political offices, but it played out in alleys, temples, in mosques, in tea shops, where arguments turned to slurs, and slurs turned to stones. By mid-morning, 2 dead bodies lay near Burrabazar. No one could say who threw the first blow, but the second blow came fast, and then the third. By noon, crowds had formed, not processions, not marches, but mobs, the kind that move without direction, only fury. Shops were torched, doors were broken, windows shattered, not with fists, but with iron rods kept ready beneath beds for weeks. Smoke began to rise, first from North Calcutta, then from the east, then across the Hooghly. People started running, but no one knew where to go, because the fires were not in one place. They were everywhere, inside homes, outside police stations, on the steps of temples, at the gates of mosques. In 1 hour, neighbors became enemies, and 2 friends became threats. By evening, a stretch of Harrison Road looked like a battlefield, trams overturned, power lines torn, bodies in the gutters. Some were Muslim, some were Hindu. None of them were spared. In one neighborhood, a school teacher named Mr. Dutt locked his classroom and hid 15 Muslim children inside. He brought them water, told them stories, covered their mouths when the screams outside grew too loud. They stayed there for 2 days. He never returned to work. In another alley near Park Circus, a Muslim tailor named Reman Ali pulled a Hindu woman and her baby into his shop moments before a mob passed. He hid them beneath a pile of fabric, pretending to be asleep when questioned. Later, he burned the cloth to remove any trace. These were the quiet moments of resistance, but they were drowned in noise. The fire engines didn't come. The police were overwhelmed, some said, complicit. Reports claimed the commissioner's office didn't expect the scale, that the crowds would thin by nightfall. They did not by nightfall. The city was glowing, not from lights, but from flames. Every hour brought new rumors. The Gurudwara has been attacked. A mosque has been burned. The water has been poisoned. A child was killed in front of her mother. Most of these were untrue, but the damage was already done, because in a city as crowded and volatile as Calcutta, truth is often less dangerous than belief. In one part of the city, a tram driver named Sharif kept his vehicle parked in the middle of an intersection for 14 hours, blocking a mob from entering the alley where his sister lived. He stood there with a wrench in hand. When asked why he didn't run, he said, because someone had to stop something. At night, dogs barked endlessly, not because of the bodies but because of the silence that followed. The kind of silence cities only hear when the noise has been forced out. People slept on rooftops, afraid of ground-level attacks. Mothers tied bells to their children's ankles so they could hear if they were taken. By the end of day 1, over 100 were dead. By the end of day 2, the official count was past 1,000. By the end of day 3, the city no longer had corners-only fronts. Hindu front, Muslim front, alley by alley, street by street. Some areas became barricaded zones, with guards posted by residents holding sticks and torches. Others became empty, entirely emptied of life, emptied of sound. In those 3 days, Calcutta stopped being a city and became a wound, raw.unheal, still aching, and in the quiet hours between each outbreak, when the mobs dissolved into smoke and the blood cooled into dark patches on stone. A strange question arose in many minds. Where did all this come from? Because there had been signs, yes, tensions, yes, but nothing to predict this scale, this depth, this loss. And as the city smoldered, one old man-up bookseller named Jatton dashed outside his ruined shop, ash in his beard, and said, "I lived through a famine. I thought that was the worst this city would ever see. I was wrong. What happened next would not make the news, not in the way the riots had, but it would matter just as much, because when a city forgets how to sleep, it also forgets how to trust it. And when it forgets how to trust, it must relearn how to stay alive." Asterisk. By the morning of August 19th, 1946, the fires had dulled, not because the violence had ended, but because there was nothing left to burn. Entire blocks were reduced to ash and hollow beams. Blackened walls stood like tombstones. Trams rested on their sides like gutted animals. The city's heartbeat had slowed not from calm, but from shock. Calcutta had not slept for 3 days. And now, as the sun rose over a skyline threaded with smoke, the city exhaled, but it did not speak. The numbers, when they came, were soft-spoken, the official count, just over 4,000 dead. But everyone in Calcutta knew that number was dishonest, too clean, too easy, because the streets had told a different story. In the lanes behind Silda, bodies had been quietly buried in unmarked pits by sweepers who did not ask questions. In the Howrah alleys, fire-charred remains were mistaken for garbage. At Tautala, a mosque had been set alight with families still inside. No names were recorded, no photographs taken. The authorities offered words: regrettable, unexpected, under control, attack. But the survivors knew otherwise. They knew that the riot hadn't been unexpected. It had been allowed, and worse, believed to be useful. Partition was not yet official, but the idea of division of lines, not just on maps, but in minds, had been given its trial run in Calcutta, and it had succeeded, because now Mosques was gone. Mosques that had stood peacefully next to temples for a century were now painted with slogans. Houses were marked with chalk. Neighborhoods renamed themselves Muslim Mohalla, Hindu Para, as if a place could be claimed by fear alone. And yet, even in the aftermath, life insisted on continuing. Milk vendors still showed up tentatively, watching for stones. Street sweepers cleared away the broken glass as best they could. A lone newspaper seller stood on the Chowring Heath footpath, offering copies that still smelled of ink. One headline read, "Calcutta riots, a city divided, a nation awaits." A man buying the paper muttered, "We used to wait for rain. Now we wait for numbers." In one lane near Bag Bazaar, a woman named Leela opened her sari shop again. The front display window was shattered, and 2 of her bolts of cloth had been looted. She lit a stick of incense and sat cross-legged on the floor, as she had done every day for years. A Muslim man passed by. He stopped. She looked up. They didn't speak, but the man stepped inside, picked up a broom from the corner, and began sweeping the broken glass. Together, in silence, they cleared the floor. Then he left, and she wept for the first time since it began. Elsewhere, relief camps opened, not run by the government, but by people who refused to let the city drown in its own sorrow. A Sikh Gurdwara fed hundreds without asking their names. A Muslim boys' school offered its classrooms as shelters. Volunteers stitched bandages from old dhotis. Teenagers carried jugs of water from neighborhood wells. Even the rickshaw pullers, many of whom had lost their homes, began offering free rides to the injured. Calcutta was not healing, but it was resisting decay. And yet, under this surface of survival, a strange numbness took hold. People stopped asking why. They stopped asking how. Instead, they focused on when to rebuild, when to leave, when the next riot might come. One man, a college professor named Amino Hack, stood before his ransacked library and said, "I used to believe knowledge made people peaceful, that if you read enough books, you wouldn't hate your neighbor. Now I realize books don't change fear." He salvaged what he could torn pages. Scorched cover sand started again. He held free classes for children who had lost their parents. He didn't ask them about religion, only whether they could read. The government promised compensation. Surveys were conducted, lists compiled, but most people never saw a rupee because the loss wasn't measurable. How do you compensate a man for learning to flinch at every loud sound? How do you reimburse a woman who now ties bells to her son's shirt because she's afraid he'll vanish if she turns away? How do you repair a city's sense of itself? You don't. You live alongside the break and slowly learn to walk differently, to speak more carefully, to look over your shoulder, to not ask questions at night. Some neighborhoods built their own clocks, not with hands or chimes, but with rules. No one leaves after sunset. No music during religious holidays. No shouting across balconies. No gatherings larger than 5. Calcutta, once known for its festivals and marches and street theater, became quieter, but not silent, because silence, too, can be a lie. One night, months after the riots, a group of children painted flowers over a blackened wall in the North Quarter. They used leftover paint from an old movie banner. They didn't ask for permission, and when a constable approached, he asked, "Why flowers?" A girl replied, "Because it's what wasn't burned." He let them finish. That wall still stands. The flowers are faded, but they are still visible. And in that neighborhood, people sometimes point to them not as art, not as protest, but as reminders that something gentle had survived, and that it had left its shape behind. Asterisk, the seasons changed. Summer gave way to a heavy monsoon, and then to winter's gray hush. But in Calcutta, the memory of those 3 days in August lingered like smoke trapped in cloth paint, persistent, impossible to wash out. There were no official memorials, no statues, no plaques, no days of mourning observed by the state. Instead, remembrance lived in smaller things. A mother refusing to board a tram past sundown, grocer who locked up at the first sign of shouting, a boy who avoided Harrison Road, though he couldn't explain why, and yet the city endured, not through triumph, but through persistence. People didn't talk about recovery. They talked about survival, getting through the next month, rebuilding the back room, finding the cousin who might still be in BARASAT, but beneath the resilience was a silence so deep it began to reshape the city's very identity. Whole neighborhoods rewrote their stories. Places that had once been shared became defined by who stayed, who fled, and who was never spoken of again. Some streets changed their names, others remained the same, but everyone knew what had happened there. A street called Ekbalper Lane was known for years, not by its name, but by a whispered phrase, the place where the shouting didn't stop. In that same lane, a tailor named Gosh Babu, whose shop had been torched on the first night, built a new stall beneath the skeleton of the old signboard. He never repainted it. When asked why, he said, "Because names can lie. Burnt wood doesn't." In South Calcutta, a small reading room reopened, shelves now half empty, its walls stained. The librarian insisted on keeping a record of every book lost during the riots. She kept it handwritten. In pencil, she said. Ink fades, but pencil resists water. And then there were the children, those who had been born after 1946. They heard only fragments, stories whispered between chores, names that stopped mid-sentence, warnings that made no sense. Don't play near that alley. Don't ask about what used to be there. Don't touch the back wallets, not ours. They grew up in a city that had survived itself, a city with invisible borders, invisible rules, and yet, oddly, a city that still laughed, still held pujas and malas, still debated politics in tea stalls, still celebrated Durga Puja with processions so large they sometimes erased, briefly, the sense that anything had ever gone wrong. But the memory lived on in patterns. A shopkeeper keeping a second exit unlocked. A landlord asking not what you earned, but who your grandfather prayed to. A post office clerk who hesitated over names that belonged to the other side. In 1951, 5 years after the riots, a group of students from Presidency College held a small exhibition titled 3 Days in August. It was a simple display. Charcoal sketches, personal diaries, still carrying the smell of fire. The authorities asked them to take it down. Too provocative, they said. The students refused, so the authorities shut off the electricity. The students lit candles, and every evening, for a week, people came. They came not to mourn, not even to understand, but to sit with something that had been buried, too. One visitor, an old tram conductor named Nizamuddin, left behind a note. It read, "I don't know who started it. We did, by choosing not to burn what was left." Later that year, someone scrawled a sentence across a wall near Babazar. "We are not healed. We are here." It stayed for months before being painted over. But those who saw it remembered, because that was the truth of Calcutta after the fires. Wasn't a city rebuilt. It was a city carried by the hawker, who still greeted the widow who once hid in a storeroom, by the policeman who chose to ignore a curfew violation if it meant someone got home safely, by the boy who delivered newspapers to both a mosque and a temple without knowing he was doing something brave, and yes, by those who refused to forget. In 1971, on the 25th anniversary of the riots, an old woman named Leela, the same woman who once reopened her sari shop with help from a stranger, lit a lamp at the base of a banyan tree near the old Tautala crossing. No one asked her why, but a few others came. A few brought flowers. One man brought a list of names on a scrap of cloth, and they stood, together, quietly, not saying the names, cloud, not chanting, just being there in the same place where once no one had dared to stand, because Clauda's great survival was not in how it rebuilt, but in how it remained, even when sleep wouldn't come, even when trust had vanished, even when no one apologized. It remained covered, scarred, alive, and still asking, without bitterness, without answer, what do we do with a memory that refuses to end? The line that became the Wagah border was drawn not on the ground, but on maps, in offices, in rooms that smelled of ink and sweat, by men who had never stepped foot on the dusty footpaths they were dividing. It was a line made of intention, not understanding, but once drawn, it became real. It split homes, fields, railways, languages, and children, especially the girls, because girls are rarely written into treaties, and the girls of partitions, those who vanished, fled, or were taken, became ghosts almost overnight, not from death, but from erasure. And nowhere was this more quietly visible than in the stretch of land that became the Wagah border. A flat, dry landscape between Lahore and Amritsar, a place where trains used to stop, not for inspection, but for chai, where families crossed without notice, where no one thought the dirt beneath their feet would one day demand a passport. In August 1947, it changed. The fences went up slowly. At first, they were just ropes, then bamboo, then barbed wire. And with each addition, the space between people became a space between countries. And in that space, girls went missing. Some were taken in the chaos by mobs, by strangers, by men, looking for revenge or bodies to claim. Some were left behind, hidden in cellars, locked inside rooms by parents hoping to save them from dishonor. Some ran into the fields, the forests, the flames trying to escape something they couldn't yet name. And some simply disappeared between one side and the other. Not dead, just gone. The first story came from a refugee camp on the Indian side. A girl, about 14, found wandering barefoot near the train tracks. Her name, Sakina. She had no documents, no memory of the crossing. She spoke Urdu with a Punjabi accent and recited verses from the Quran. Under her breath, while tearing grass into pieces, they placed her in a women's shelter in Amritsar. She didn't speak for 3 days. Then, one morning, she whispered, "I was with my mother on the train. Then there were men. Then there was red. Then there was nothing." Her file was marked orphan, nationality uncertain. She remained in India. 2 years later, a man arrived from Lahore, claiming to be her uncle. He brought a photograph and a piece of her mother's jewelry, but Sakina did not recognize him. She had forgotten too much. Or maybe she had remembered too clearly. She was never sent back. She stayed in a house with a Hindu family who raised her as their own. Her real family gone. Her language changed. Her gods blurred. Her life split between 2 countries, neither of which knew quite what to call her. She was not the only one. In the months following partition, thousands of girls and women were lost in transit. The governments of India and Pakistan eventually agreed to a recovery and repatriation protocol. Special officers were appointed, trucks dispatched, lists drawn. One side would return Hindu and Sikh girls. The other would return Muslim girls. It sounded noble on paper, but in practice was brutal, because by then, many of these girls had been forcibly married, had children, had taken new names, or had simply adapted to survive. And now, strangers were arriving claiming them, pointing to them, telling them they no longer belonged where they were. Some refused to return. Some cried silently while boarding the recovery trucks. Some jumped from them before reaching the border. One girl, taken from a home in Siakhand, where she had lived for a year, as Aisha stood at the Wagah checkpoint and refused to step forward. She said, "I crossed once. I will not cross again." She was beaten by guards, then sent back anyway. She did not make it past the barbed wire. What happened to her after that is not written down, because stories like hers are only half told. Even now, some of the lost girls became part of families that never called them daughters. Some became wives before they finished being children. Some grew old, never knowing the truth about the day the train stopped and the line was drawn and the silence began. And some, just a few, became names on fragile lists buried in dusty archives. There's one such list still kept in an iron drawer in a Lahore police office, typed YELLOWED. Stamped. It reads, Subida, age 15, last seen near Kasar Crossing. Neela, age unknown, said to have crossed with wounded aunt. Pushpa, 13, rescued from house fire in Gandasingwala. Not claimed. Unknown scar on left cheek. Speaks Bengali. No papers. Beside each name, single column, returned. Yes, no, unknown. Most say unknown, because many were never found, and those who were weren't always the same. The Wagah border today is a place of ceremony. Tourists gather to watch the lowering of the flags. There's music, applause, synchronized stomping, but a few feet away, there's still a gate, still that long strip of no man's land, and behind that, memories that don't march, don't salute, don't perform. They wait in silence, in the dust, in the absence of girls who were never given the luxury of finishing girlhood. Asterisk, by 1950. The governments of India and Pakistan had stopped calling them missing girls. Now they were recovered. Women sounded cleaner. Administrative, a process that could be documented and filed. India created the Central Recovery Office in Delhi. Pakistan followed with its own bureau in Lahore. Each side made pledges to locate abducted women and girls, to protect them during repatriation, to respect their wishes. But wishes didn't fit neatly into forms, because most of the recovered girls no longer knew what to wish for. They were found in the strangest places, behind haystacks, inside burned-out homes, under false names, or sitting quietly in the back of a family that had already decided they belonged. Some were dressed in clothes from the other religion. Some carried infants they refused to leave behind. Some didn't speak at all, just looked past everyone, as if their eyes were stuck in the days that vanished. And when the recovery officers came, they came with uniforms and stamps and trucks. They said things like, "Your family is alive. Come with us. This is not your home. You are one of ours. We will take you back." Back to what? Many of these girls had been 12 or 13 in 1947. Now they were 16, or married, or mothers, or adopted into villages that didn't care where they'd come from as long as they worked, stayed quiet, and didn't ask to go back. And yet, the trucks kept arriving. One officer, Colonel Bhargava, was known for his dedication. He personally oversaw hundreds of repatriations from Pakistan to India. But even he admitted, in a quiet entry in his diary, "I returned them, but they do not come back. They cross borders, but never arrive." The official count, around 30,000 women and girls recovered between 1947 and 1956. But the unofficial number, no one knows, because so many vanished between lines in trains, in fields, behind walls. And the saddest truth, not all of them were taken by force. Some were left intentionally in moments of panic or shame or fear. There are stories of fathers who handed their daughters to neighbors across the religious divide, begging, "Protect her, say she is yours." And the neighbors did. But when peace returned, when borders were set, and recovery trucks rolled in, the same fathers refused to take them back. One man, when shown a girl who had been sheltered for 2 years by a Muslim family, said, "She eats with the wrong hand now. I do not know her." The officers marked her file, rejected by family, repatriated regardless. Another girl, Anita, was found living under the name Amina in a village outside Siakat. She was married to a farmer, had a child. When the recovery officers arrived, she said, "My husband saved me. I will not leave." They tried to convince her. They told her that she was born Hindu, that her parents were alive in India. She answered, "I was born once. Then I was born again when the house burned, and this man hid me in a well. I only remember the second time." She was not taken. Her file was marked uncooperative, left in place. Years later, researchers studying these files would be haunted not by the violence, but by the phrases, "will not speak," cries when questioned, "too young to remember origin," "speaks both tongues," "cannot be certain." They were documents written in detachment, but the girls in them were not detached. They had learned to adapt to the cracks of history, to survive in silence, to understand that sometimes it is safer to not remember. One girl, rescued from a home in Punjab, where she had lived for 3 years as a maid, was taken to a refugee camp in Ambala. There, she refused food. She tore her own clothes. She ran away twice. When asked why, she whispered, "They said I belonged there, but no one told the wind. It still smells like them." She was eventually sent to a rehabilitation center in Delhi. She never left, even today. There are graves on both sides of the border, marked only with first names. Nita, Farzana, Shanti, Yasmin, no. Fathers listed, no families known, just names the earth agreed to keep at Wagah. The daily flag ceremony now draws thousands. People cheer, music blares. Guards stomp in mirror mage rhythms. but a few meters away, the old customs building, now sealed, is a dusty room once used to process the recovered women. The benches are cracked. The ceiling is bowed, but on one wall, it's just above the doorway. Someone once wrote in chalk, "If I crossed once, must I keep crossing forever?" No one erased it, but the wall was painted over in 1984. And yet, some say, when the light hits just right at dusk, the faint outline of those words returns, as if the girls who once stood there barefoot, uncertain, unclaimed, still need us to read it and to ask ourselves, what does it mean to be returned, but never welcomed, to be repatriated, but never remembered, to live between countries, but belong to none? By the early 1960s, most of the recovery work was considered complete. The reports were filed. The trucks stopped rolling. Special officers were reassigned or quietly retired. Budgets were reabsorbed into other ministries. The urgency faded, and so did the girls. Not literally. They didn't vanish like they did in 1947. They simply stopped being spoken of because no one knew quite where to place them. Not in war memorials, not in family trees, not even in textbooks. Too painful, too complicated, too alive. They weren't victims with neat endings. They weren't martyrs. They weren't exactly refugees. And they were never allowed to be just girls again. Some lived long lives. Some married again once by force, then by choice. Some kept the names they were given during partition. Some returned to their birth names. Only in death, but none of them escaped the border, because even decades later, it followed them in their silence, in their documents, in the long pause after someone asked, "Where are you from?" There is one story almost forgotten. Nave, a woman named Soraya, who lived in a nursing home in Amritsar into the 1990s. She was in her 60s, sharp-eyed and strong-voiced, but rarely spoke of her early years. One evening, a young journalist visited her, working on a piece about partition survivors. He asked the usual questions. Where were you in 47? What did you see? What did you lose? She smiled, then asked him one of her own. Do you know what the first thing I ever owned was? He shook his head. She said, a name I didn't choose. Then she opened a drawer and pulled out a piece of yellowed paper. On it, 2 names were written, one in Urdu, one in Hindi. Both were hers, but neither fit anymore, she said. I don't need them now, but I keep them to remember what was taken before I knew I could say no. After she passed, her belongings were boxed and sent to an archive in CHNDIGARH. No relatives came forward. Her file is still there, labeled unverified female, possible partition survivor. Known aliases, 2. Confirmed home, unknown. It's kept in a drawer alongside hundreds of others. And in those drawers, stories are not dead. They breathe, because the girls who were lost were never just names on paper. They were languages caught, mid-sentence. They were wrists with missing bangles, earrings with no pair, shoes that didn't fit anymore because the feet had learned to run, and still, no country claimed them properly. They were not counted in the glories of independence. They were not celebrated in the anniversaries of freedom. Even the border guards who stand tall at wagga chests, puffed boots stomping do not salute them, because how do you salute someone you never saw? How do you account for silence? In 2013, a researcher named Dr. Reena Kapoor began compiling oral testimonies of these women. She found some in rural homes, others in care centers, a few in Pakistan, many in India. Their memories were fragmented, stitched together with confusion, and yet the pain was precise. One woman, Fatima, said, I was taken across in a cart. They called it rescue. I called it forgetting. Another Kamla said, I came back with nothing but a blouse that didn't fit. They said, We're glad you're alive. I wasn't. And then there were those who spoke of longing not for a home, but for a version of themselves that no longer existed. A girl who once tied her braids with ribbon, who laughed during mango season, who believed in weddings and clay, dolls and monsoon songs. That girl died, not in fire, not in blood, but in the crossing, because the act of being taken and then being taken back was not a return. It was another kind of loss, a loss too subtle to name, too wide to contain. Dr. Kapoor later wrote, "We have measured partition by the numbers, dead, displaced, divided, but we have never measured the hollow it left in women. We built nations on silence, and these girls were its deepest well." In 2022, a proposal was raised in India's parliament to create a digital memorial for women affected by partition. It did not pass, too vague, too politically sensitive, too late. And so, the girls remain where they always have, in footnotes, in oral histories, in the gaps between two countries who still argue about maps, but not about memory, because memory doesn't ask permission. It lingers, it names names, even when no one else will. And at the Wagah border, if you go early in the morning before the flags rise, before the parades begin, you might hear nothing but wind. But those who know say that wind is not empty. It carries the footsteps of girls who once walked here, not for glory, not for witness, but because they were told to run. And some of them are still running. Asterisk, in a narrow alley near Model Town in Lahore, nestled between a bakery and a half-shuttered tailor shop, once stood a small, single-room school. Its name was painted in faded Urdu script above a crooked wooden door. Madarse Aman, a place for learning for all. It was never registered officially. It never had more than 20 students at a time, but it had one thing few places in 1947 still possessed: routine. And that routine belonged to Ustad Mahesh Das, a Hindu man, a quiet man, a man who wore the same brown kurta each day and carried chalk sticks in his shirt pocket like they were coins of prayer. He was neither political nor devout, but he believed deeply in two things: the power of reading aloud, that children should not be asked to carry the weight of grown-up hatred. In July of 1947, as Lahore began to shift under the tremors of partition, Mahesh Das kept the school open, even when whispers grew louder, even when some children stopped attending, even when his neighbors began asking quietly, "Why are you still here?" The school had no fence, no bell, no government-issued flag. It had one long table, a shelf of old Urdu and Punjabi storybooks, and a blackboard that leaned slightly to the left. And yet, it remained a sanctuary for children of all kinds: Muslim, Hindu, Sikh, Dats, sons of shopkeepers, daughters of housemaids, a boy whose father drove the tram, a girl whose brother would soon disappear in the riots. Each morning, Mahesh Das arrived before the sun crested the roofs. He swept the floor, lit a small diya in the corner, not out of ritual, but out of habit. Then he would wait, and the children would come, not always many, sometimes only 4, sometimes none, but he still wrote the date on the board: July 25th, 1947, August 1st, 1947, August 8th. Even as the city cracked around him, the bakery next door stopped baking bread. The tailor left without notice, shouter flapping like a question. The walls began to whisper, and still Mahesh taught. He read stories from Heer Ranja and Akbarba. He taught fractions using pebbles from the courtyard. He showed the children how to trace maps that would soon be useless. One morning, a girl named Amina asked, "Ustad, would the school move too?" Mahesh paused, then said, "The school is not in the room. 'Tis in your remembering." The children didn't fully understand, but they remembered that line years later. When the school was gone, and when remembering became all they had, by mid-August, Lahore was no longer safe. The signs were clear. The local police station no longer responded to calls after sunset. The bazaar closed before noon. Firecrackers were mistaken for gunshots and sometimes weren't mistaken at all, and whole families began disappearing overnight. Still, Mahesh did not leave. Not when his cousin begged him from across the new Indian border. Not when stones were thrown at the school's front door. Not even when someone carved the word kafir into the side of the building with a blade. He stayed, and he taught. On August 13th, only one child came to school, Rafi, a shy boy with a stammer and a missing front tooth. He stood in the doorway, holding his slate. Mahesh welcomed him in. He gave him the day's lesson. A story about a tree that gave fruit to those who didn't speak. Rafi didn't speak the whole time, but when it was over, he hugged Mahesh and ran home. It was the last day any student came. On August 14th, school was silent. On August 15th, Pakistan was born. There were fireworks in some neighborhoods, cries of joy in others. But in Model Town, there was mostly watching. People peered from behind curtains. They checked each other's expressions, measured loyalty by silence. That night, someone knocked on the school door. Mahesh opened it, expecting a student. It was not. It was a group of young men, faces hidden by cloth, sticks in hand, anger in their eyes, but not confusion. They knew who he was. They said, "Teacher, your classroom is not part of this country anymore." He didn't respond. He simply stepped aside. They entered. They overturned the table, ripped the books, smashed the diya, marked the walls. And as they turned to leave, one of them paused. He looked back and said, "Why didn't you go?" Hesh looked him in the eye and replied, "Because the chalk hadn't finished writing." They didn't understand. They left. He slept in the school that night, and in the morning, he cleaned. Alone, he straightened the board, swept the shards, picked up a piece of chalk, and wrote, August 16th, 1947. No students today, but the lesson remains. Asterisk.